I just need $2 more. Please, my baby hasn't eaten since this morning. Claire Whitmore's voice barely rose above a whisper, but in the quiet tension of the checkout line, it felt louder than it should have been, as if every pair of eyes in the store had suddenly turned toward her at once. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a pale, unforgiving glow on her worn coat and trembling hands as she stood frozen at the register. A single can of baby formula clutched tightly against her chest like it was the only thing holding her together, the cashier hesitating with a polite but strained smile as the total blinked on the screen, $18.27, while the small pile of coins and crumpled bills on the counter barely reached $16, and behind her, the faint sound of a line forming, shuffling feet, quiet sighs, someone checking their watch, pressed against her back like a weight she couldn't escape. Claire swallowed hard, her throat dry as she glanced down at her son bundled in the carrier strapped to her chest, his tiny face scrunched, soft whimpers escaping as his small hands curled against the thin fabric of her sweater. And that sound alone made her chest tighten painfully, because she knew that cry, knew what it meant, knew it had already gone on too long today. She forced a breath, her fingers shaking as she tried to recount the money again, as if the numbers might somehow change. But they didn't. They never did, and the cashier finally cleared her throat gently. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You're short." And that was it, the last fragile thread snapping as Claire's eyes flickered closed for a second, her shoulders sagging under the invisible weight of exhaustion and quiet humiliation, the kind that didn't scream but settled deep in your bones. She hurriedly began to gather the coins back, mumbling, "It's okay. I'll just take something else." Even though there was nothing else to take, nothing cheaper that wouldn't make her baby sick, and she knew it, but saying it out loud felt impossible, like admitting failure in front of strangers who would forget her in 5 minutes, but whose glances still burned. Her hands moved quickly, almost clumsy, as she reached for the formula to set it aside. But her son let out a sharper cry at that exact moment, louder, more desperate, and Claire froze, her heart twisting, because that sound cut deeper than anything else in that store, deeper than the stares, deeper than the embarrassment, deeper than her own pride. And before she could stop herself, she turned slightly, her voice barely holding together as she looked at the man standing behind her. "I'm sorry. I know this is strange, but could you help me just a little? I'll pay you back, I promise. He needs this." And for a second, the world seemed to pause. The man she had spoken to didn't answer immediately, and Claire felt the heat rise to her face as regret flooded in almost instantly. What was she thinking, asking a complete stranger like that? But desperation had already pushed her past the point of holding back. The man stood tall, sharply dressed in a dark tailored coat that looked out of place in the small grocery store, his posture straight, his expression unreadable as his eyes shifted from her face to the baby in her arms, and then to the formula sitting on the counter. And something in that gaze lingered just a fraction longer than it should have, as if he were noticing details others wouldn't. But he still said nothing, and the silence stretched just long enough for Claire's hope to start collapsing inward again. She quickly shook her head, pulling back. "I'm sorry. Forget I asked," her voice shrinking as she turned toward the cashier, already bracing herself to walk away empty-handed, already preparing to figure out how to stretch what little she had left at home, even if it meant another long night of her son crying and her pacing the tiny apartment, whispering apologies he was too young to understand. But before she could move, before she could pick up the coins and retreat, the man behind her stepped forward, calm, deliberate, placing a sleek black card onto the counter with a quiet, decisive motion that cut cleanly through the tension, and without looking at her, he said in a low, steady voice, "Add everything she needs." And for a moment, Claire just stood there, stunned, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and relief, not yet understanding why this stranger had chosen to step in, or why the way he was looking at her now felt less like a random act of kindness, and more like he was searching for something he hadn't expected to find. Claire stared at the black card on the counter as if it might disappear if she blinked, her fingers tightening instinctively around the strap of the baby carrier, while her son's soft cries filled the space between her thoughts, grounding her in a reality that still felt unreal, and she shook her head quickly, her voice catching as she forced herself to speak. No, I cannot accept that. It is too much. I only needed a couple of dollars. But the cashier had already taken the card, glancing uncertainly between them before beginning to scan the items again, and the man did not move, did not even look at her this time. His attention fixed somewhere distant as if what he had just done required no explanation at all, and that somehow made it feel even heavier. Claire swallowed, her cheeks burning as she tried again, lowering her voice. I will pay you back. I mean it. I just need a few days. But he finally turned slightly, his gaze settling on her with a calm intensity that made her words falter. Take care of your child first, he said simply, and there was something in the way he said it that did not sound like advice, but more like a quiet expectation, as if he already knew she would do exactly that. The register beeped steadily as more items were added, things she had not even picked up herself, extra formula, a pack of diapers, a small box of infant medicine. And Claire's breath hitched as she realized what was happening, her hand instinctively reaching out. Wait. Please, that is not necessary. But the cashier hesitated, glancing again at the man, and he gave a slight nod without speaking, and that was enough for the total to climb higher on the screen, numbers that made Claire's stomach twist because they were so far beyond anything she could manage right now. Her son let out another small cry, weaker this time, and she looked down quickly, brushing her fingers gently against his cheek, whispering softly under her breath, It is okay. I have you. But even as she said it, doubt crept in, because she had been saying that all day and still ended up here. When the transaction finally went through, the cashier handed her the bags with a quiet smile that carried a hint of sympathy, and Claire accepted them slowly, her hands trembling not just from exhaustion but from the weight of what had just happened. Because this was not just help. This was something else, something she could not quite name. She turned back, toward the man, her voice softer now, more careful. Thank you. I do not even know your name. And for the first time, he studied her fully, his eyes moving from her face to the baby and back again, lingering just long enough to make her pulse quicken, as if he were piecing something together in silence. Adrian, he said finally, his tone even, controlled, but there was a faint shift in his expression, something almost unreadable, and Claire nodded, committing it to memory without understanding why it felt important. She adjusted the bags in her arms, preparing to leave, to step out of this moment and return to the fragile life waiting for her outside those doors. But before she could take more than a step, her phone rang sharply, the sudden sound cutting through everything, and Claire froze as she pulled it out, her heart already racing before she even answered, because there was only one person who would call her like that. And as she lifted the phone to her ear, her voice dropped into a breathless whisper, Hello. And the words on the other end made the color drain from her face instantly, her grip tightening around the bags as she staggered slightly in place. What do you mean he is having trouble breathing? The words on the other end of the line seemed to echo inside Claire's head, stretching out longer than they should have as her grip tightened around the phone and the plastic bags slipped slightly against her wrist, her voice trembling as she tried to stay calm. Is he conscious? Did you check his temperature again? But the answer only made her heart pound harder, and for a second, she could not hear anything except the rush of blood in her ears, her breath coming shallow and uneven as the small sounds of the grocery store faded into the background, replaced by a single overwhelming thought that something was wrong and she was not there. I am coming right now, she said quickly, her voice barely steady as she ended the call and lowered the phone, her eyes wide and unfocused as she turned toward the exit without fully seeing it, her body already moving before her mind could catch up, the bags shifting awkwardly in her arms as her son stirred and let out a weak cry that felt sharper now, more urgent, and Claire pressed her cheek briefly against his head as she whispered, I am here, even though she knew they still had blocks to go, too far to walk quickly, too far when every second suddenly mattered. She took a step forward, then another, her pace quickening into something close to a stumble as she tried to calculate the fastest way home, the bus schedule flashing uselessly in her mind, the cost of a ride she could not afford even. After what had just happened, and her chest tightened again because time was slipping and she could feel it. You will not make it on foot in time, a voice said behind her, calm but firm, cutting through her spiraling thoughts like a line drawn straight through chaos. And Claire turned sharply, her breath catching as she saw Adrian standing there, watching her with that same unreadable expression. But now there was something else beneath it, something sharper, more focused. She shook her head, instinctively, clutching the bags closer. I cannot ask you for more. You have already done too much. But he stepped closer without hesitation, his gaze dropping briefly to the baby in her arms before returning to her face. This is not about asking, he said evenly. This is about getting you there now. And the certainty in his voice made her pause, because it did not sound like an offer. It sounded like a decision already made. Claire hesitated, every instinct telling her to be careful, to not trust too easily. But the image of her child struggling for breath pushed everything else aside, and she nodded once, quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. 15 blocks, near Maple Street. And Adrian did not respond with surprise or hesitation, only a brief nod as he turned and motioned toward the parking lot, his stride purposeful, expecting her to follow. The cold air outside hit Claire's face as she stepped through the doors, the sudden shift making her blink as she hurried after him, her heart still racing as she adjusted her hold on the bags and the baby. And within seconds they reached a sleek black car parked near the entrance, its presence as out of place as Adrian himself. And he opened the passenger door without a word, his movements efficient, controlled. Claire hesitated for half a second, just long enough for doubt to flicker again, but another soft, strained sound from her son erased it completely, and she climbed inside, settling the bags at her feet and adjusting the carrier as carefully as she could while Adrian closed the door and moved to the driver's side. The engine started smoothly, the car pulling away from the curb with a quiet power that contrasted sharply with the storm inside her chest. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the faint hum of the road and the uneven rhythm of Claire's breathing, until Adrian's voice broke through again, steady, deliberate. How old is your son? And Claire blinked, caught off guard by the question, her fingers instinctively brushing over the baby's small hand as she answered, 6 months. And she did not miss the subtle shift in the air after she said it, the way Adrian's grip on the steering wheel tightened just slightly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but sharper now, calculating in a way that made something uneasy stir in her chest, as if this moment was leading somewhere she did not yet understand. The car moved faster now, weaving through late afternoon traffic with a precision that made Claire grip the edge of her seat, her eyes flicking between the road ahead and the small rise and fall of her son's chest as she tried to steady her breathing, counting each breath he took as if it might anchor her in place. And for a moment, she almost forgot the man driving beside her until his voice cut through again, quieter this time but sharper. When exactly did he turn 6 months? And the question made her pause, her fingers stilling against the baby's blanket as she answered automatically. 2 weeks ago, before the weight of the question settled in her mind, because it was not something most strangers would ask, not with that level of precision. Adrian did not respond immediately, but his jaw tightened slightly, his eyes fixed ahead as if he were running through something internally, something that did not need to be spoken out loud, and Claire felt a flicker of unease she could not explain, the kind that did not come from fear of him, but from the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something she did not understand. She shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting the baby as another weak sound escaped him, softer now, and her chest tightened again. He has been running a fever since this morning, she said quickly, as if explaining might help. I tried to manage it, but then my neighbor called and said his breathing sounded different. Her voice wavering at the last word, and Adrian nodded once, absorbing the information without interruption, his tone calm, but decisive when he spoke again. We are not going to your apartment. And Claire's head snapped toward him, her heart skipping. What do you mean? She asked, her voice edged with confusion and rising panic. I need to get to him. But Adrian's hands remained steady on the wheel, his voice unwavering. If his breathing is irregular, he needs medical attention, not a delay. And for a split second Claire opened her mouth to argue, instinctively pushing back, because hospitals meant bills, and bills meant problems she could not solve. But the image of her son struggling for breath crushed that hesitation instantly, leaving only a hollow silence where her resistance had been. She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the baby in her arms as she whispered, almost to herself, I cannot afford an emergency room. and the words felt small compared to the urgency pressing in around her. But Adrian's response came without hesitation, firm and controlled. That is not your priority right now. And there was something in his tone that made her look up again, something that did not invite disagreement, something that felt like a line being drawn. The car took a sharp turn, the city streets blurring past as Claire realized they were heading in a different direction, one she did not recognize, and her pulse quickened again. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice quieter now, more cautious, and Adrian finally glanced at her, just for a second. But it was enough for her to catch the intensity in his eyes, something deeper than concern, something almost personal. "The nearest hospital with a pediatric unit," he said. And then, after a brief pause that felt heavier than the words themselves, he added, "They will be ready when we arrive." And Claire blinked, confusion threading through her fear, because that did not sound like a guess or a hope. It sounded like certainty. And as the car accelerated slightly, her grip tightened around her son, her mind racing not only with worry for him, but with a growing question she could not ignore. How could this man speak as if the hospital was already expecting them, as if this moment had already been set in motion long before she ever turned around in that grocery store? The car slowed only slightly as it turned into the hospital entrance, the large glass doors reflecting the fading light of the evening, while Claire's heart pounded so loudly it felt like it filled the entire space around her, her fingers tightening instinctively around her son as she leaned forward, watching as Adrian pulled up directly in front of the emergency entrance without hesitation, and before the car had even come to a full stop. The doors slid open and 2 medical staff members were already stepping out with a small gurney and equipment, their movements quick and coordinated in a way that made Claire freeze for a split second because this was not normal. This was not how things usually happened. "We are here," Adrian said calmly, already stepping out of the car and moving to her side, opening the door before she could react, and Claire blinked, trying to process what she was seeing as one of the nurses approached her immediately, her voice steady and reassuring. "Ma'am, we are going to take your baby and get him checked right away." And Claire hesitated, instinctively pulling her son closer for a fraction of a second before reality pushed through her fear, and she nodded quickly, her hands trembling as she carefully passed him over, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Please be careful," her eyes following every movement as they placed him gently on the gurney and moved swiftly toward the doors. She stepped forward automatically, but her legs felt unsteady, her breath uneven as the weight in her arms suddenly disappeared, leaving behind a hollow space that made everything feel sharper, louder, more real, and she almost stumbled before catching herself, her gaze fixed on the doors as they closed behind the medical team. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen in place, until Adrian's voice came again, closer now, quieter but firm. "They are moving quickly because they were prepared," and Claire turned toward him, confusion and disbelief mixing with the fear already flooding her chest. "Prepared? How could they be prepared?" she asked, her voice shaking as she searched his face for an answer, because nothing about this felt random anymore. Nothing about this felt like chance. Adrian held her gaze for a brief moment, and there was something in his expression that shifted again, something more controlled, more deliberate, as if he were deciding how much to say. "I made a call," he replied simply, and Claire stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up with the meaning behind those words. Because making a call did not explain this. It did not explain the way the staff had been waiting, the way everything moved without delay, the way he spoke as if this level of response was expected. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of the cold air and the emptiness where her son had been moments ago, her voice quieter now but sharper. "Who are you?" And the question hung there between them, heavier than anything she had said before. Adrian did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting briefly toward the hospital doors as if tracking something beyond them, before returning to her, and for the first time since she had met him, there was a subtle crack in his composure, not uncertainty, but something closer to recognition, something that made the air between them feel charged in a way Claire could not explain. "Right now," he said slowly, his voice measured, "I am the person making sure your son gets the care he needs." And it should have sounded reassuring. It should have been enough. But it was not, because the way he said it carried something deeper, something that hinted at a connection she had not seen yet. Claire opened her mouth to press further, to demand clarity, but before she could speak, the hospital doors opened again, and a nurse stepped out, scanning the area quickly before her eyes landed on Adrian. And her expression shifted immediately, straightening with a level of recognition and respect that Claire noticed instantly. "Mr. Blackwood, the pediatric team is ready for you," she said, and the name hit Claire like a sudden jolt, her breath catching as she turned toward him, the pieces not fully forming yet but beginning to align in a way that made her pulse quicken again, because this was no longer just a stranger who had helped her in a moment of desperation. This was someone far more powerful, someone whose presence had changed everything the moment he stepped into her life. The name echoed in Claire's mind as if it had weight, her breath catching slightly as she repeated it silently, Blackwood, and even without fully placing it, she knew it was not just a name. It was something larger, something tied to power and influence in a way that made the pieces begin to shift into place. And she looked at Adrian again, really looked at him this time, at the way he carried himself, the way people responded to him without hesitation, the quiet authority in every word he spoke, and a flicker of realization began to settle in. But before she could fully grasp it, he turned toward the nurse with a small nod, his focus sharpening immediately. "Take us to him," he said, his tone calm, but carrying an edge of urgency that did not need to be raised to be felt. Claire followed instinctively, her steps quick but uneven as they moved through the sliding doors and into the bright, sterile hallway. The air inside cooler, sharper, filled with the faint scent of disinfectant and the distant hum of machines, and everything felt too fast and too slow at the same time as she tried to keep up, her eyes darting from one corridor to another, searching for any sign, any clue about her son, her heart tightening with every second that passed. The nurse led them through a series of turns without stopping, past other patients, past staff who seemed to glance at Adrian with recognition before quickly stepping aside. And Claire noticed it, the subtle shift in the way people moved around him, the way doors opened faster, the way voices lowered slightly, and it only deepened the question building inside her, because this was not normal. None of this was normal. They reached a set of double doors marked pediatric care, and the nurse pushed them open without hesitation, gesturing for them to enter as she spoke quickly. "The doctor is already with him." And Claire did not wait. She stepped forward immediately, her breath catching as her eyes scanned the room until they landed on the small figure lying on the hospital bed, surrounded by monitors and soft lights, her son looking impossibly small against the white sheets. And for a moment the world narrowed down to that single image, everything else fading away as she rushed to his side, her hands hovering just above him as if afraid to touch, her voice breaking into a whisper. "I am here. I am here," repeating the words like a promise she refused to break. A doctor stood nearby, adjusting something on one of the machines before turning toward them, his expression focused but calm. His breathing was irregular when he arrived, but we are stabilizing him now, he explained, his tone steady, practiced, and Claire nodded quickly even though the words felt distant, her attention fixed on every small movement her son made, every rise and fall of his chest, as if she could will it to stay steady. Behind her, Adrian stepped closer, but he did not speak. Immediately, his gaze fixed on the child with an intensity that felt almost out of place, almost too personal for someone who had only just met them, and Claire felt it without turning, that shift in the air, that silent focus that seemed to draw everything toward it. The doctor continued, glancing briefly at Adrian with a hint of recognition before returning his attention to Claire. "We will need some basic information, medical history, any prior conditions." And Claire blinked, pulling herself back just enough to answer, her voice unsteady but determined as she provided what she could, her mind racing to recall every detail, every symptom, anything that might help. Adrian remained still for a moment longer, his eyes not leaving the child. And then he spoke, his voice low but carrying across the room with quiet authority. "Run a full panel," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a directive, and the doctor hesitated for the briefest second before nodding. Already turning to relay the instruction, Claire turned slightly at that, her confusion deepening again, because that was not how strangers spoke in hospitals. That was not how decisions were made. And as she looked at Adrian now, standing there with that same composed presence, She realized the truth was no longer something she could ignore. This man was not just someone who had helped her. He was someone who had the power to change everything around him, and the question that rose in her chest felt heavier now, sharper, because it was no longer just about who he was, but why he was here, why he was looking at her child like that, as if this moment meant something more than either of them had said out loud. Claire stood there, her hand finally resting lightly against her son's tiny arm as if anchoring herself to him. Her breath still uneven, but slowing slightly as the steady rhythm of the monitors began to replace the chaos that had filled her chest moments ago, and she focused on that sound, on the quiet assurance that he was still there, still fighting, still hers. But even as relief tried to settle in, something else pressed in around her, something she could not ignore any longer. She glanced over her shoulder again, her eyes finding Adrian where he stood just a few feet away, his posture composed, his expression controlled, but there was no distance in the way he looked at the child now, no detachment. It was too focused, too intense, like he was searching for something specific, something only he could see, and that made a slow unease curl in her chest. "You are acting like you already know him," she said quietly, her voice careful but edged with something sharper now, not accusation yet, but not simple curiosity either. And for a moment, Adrian did not respond, his gaze still fixed on the small rise and fall of the baby's chest, as if the answer lay somewhere in that fragile rhythm. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate. "I am trying to understand something." And that answer only deepened the tension in the room, because it did not explain anything. It only confirmed that there was something to understand. Claire turned fully now, her body shifting protectively closer to the bed without even realizing it, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. "Understand what?" she pressed, and this time Adrian looked at her directly, his expression tightening just enough to reveal that whatever he was thinking was no longer simple or distant. It was personal. He took a slow breath, as if measuring his next words carefully, and then his gaze flicked briefly back to the baby before returning to her. "His features," he said, and the way he said it made Claire's stomach drop slightly, because it was not a casual observation. It was something precise, something calculated. She followed his gaze instinctively, looking down at her son again, at the small details she knew so well, the soft curve of his cheeks, the faint shape of his nose, the way his tiny fingers curled, and for a moment, she saw nothing unusual, nothing out of place, just her baby, just the child she had held and cared for every single day. But when she looked back up at Adrian, the intensity in his expression had not faded. If anything, it had sharpened. "You said he is 6 months old," Adrian continued, his tone steady but carrying an undercurrent that made Claire's pulse pick up again. "And you said his birthday was 2 weeks ago," and Claire nodded slowly, her confusion deepening. "Yes? Why does that matter?" she asked, her voice quieter now, more cautious, because she could feel the direction this was moving in even if she could not yet name it. Adrian did not answer immediately, his jaw tightening slightly as he seemed to run through something internally, something that required precision, timing, certainty. And then he stepped closer, just enough to close the distance between them, his voice dropping lower, almost private despite the room around them. "Because the timeline does not leave much room for error," he said, and the words hung there, heavy and incomplete, like the beginning of a truth that had not yet been fully spoken. Claire felt her breath catch again, her fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the hospital bed as a flicker of something sharp and unexpected moved through her. Not fear, not yet, but something close to it. Something that came from the realization that this was no longer just about a stranger helping her in a moment of need. This was about something deeper, something that connected him to her life in a way she had never prepared for. And as she looked at him now, searching for clarity, the question formed on its own, stronger than before. "What are you trying to say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, and Adrian held her gaze for a long second before answering, his expression shifting into something resolute, something that suggested he was no longer going to keep the distance he had maintained until now. But just as the words seemed ready to leave his lips, one of the machines let out a sharper sound, drawing both of their attention instantly back to the child. And the moment broke, leaving the truth hanging just out of reach, heavier than ever. The sharp sound from the monitor cut through the tension like a sudden jolt, pulling Claire's entire focus back to her son as her breath hitched and her hand instinctively reached for him again, her fingers trembling slightly as she whispered his name under her breath, repeating it like a quiet anchor while the nurse stepped in quickly, adjusting a sensor and checking the readings with practiced calm. "It is okay." His oxygen dipped for a moment. "But he is responding," she said reassuringly, and Claire nodded, even though her chest still felt tight, her eyes refusing to leave the small movements of her child as she searched for any sign that he was stabilizing, any sign that she was not about to lose control of the only thing that mattered to her. Beside her, Adrian had gone completely still, his gaze locked on the monitor, then shifting back to the baby with a focus that felt even more intense than before, as if that single fluctuation had confirmed something inside him rather than shaken it. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower now, more certain, as he had breathing issues before. And Claire shook her head quickly, her voice firm despite the fear still lingering. "No, never like this, just mild colds, nothing serious." And Adrian nodded once, absorbing the information in a way that felt deliberate, methodical, like he was assembling pieces that only he understood. The doctor stepped closer again, glancing at both of them before addressing Claire. "We are going to run a few more tests to rule out anything underlying, but right now he is stabilizing." And Claire let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding, her shoulders dropping slightly as relief tried to settle in, fragile but real, and she leaned closer to her son, brushing her fingers gently against his hand again, grounding herself in his warmth. But even in that moment, she could feel Adrian's presence beside her, steady, unyielding, and she knew the conversation from before had not ended. It had only been interrupted, and, sure enough, his voice came again, quieter but carrying a weight that made her look up immediately. "Claire," he said, her name sounding different now, more intentional, more personal, and she turned toward him slowly, her heart beginning to race again for a different reason, because the look in his eyes had changed. It was no longer just curiosity or concern, it was something resolved, something that had reached a conclusion. "There is something you need to tell me," he continued, and the way he said it made her instinctively tense, her body shifting slightly closer to the bed again, protective without even thinking. "I have told you everything," she replied, her voice quieter now, but edged with uncertainty, because she could feel that was not what he meant. Adrian held her gaze, unwavering, and for a moment the room seemed to narrow again, the sounds of the machines fading into the background as his next words landed carefully, deliberately. "Then tell me this," he said, his tone controlled but carrying an undercurrent that made her pulse spike. "Who is his father?" And the question hit harder than she expected, not because she had not been asked before, but because of the way he asked it, like it mattered in a way it never had to anyone else, like the answer was not just a detail, but a key to something larger. Claire's breath caught slightly, her eyes flickering away for a brief second before returning to him, her expression tightening as she answered. "He is not in the picture." And it was the truth she had repeated countless times, simple, closed, final. But Adrian did not react the way others usually did. He did not nod or step back or let it go. Instead, his gaze sharpened, his voice dropping even lower, more precise. "That is not what I asked." And the weight of his words pressed into the space between them, leaving no room for avoidance, no easy way out. Claire felt her chest tighten again, her mind racing as something cold and unfamiliar began to settle in. Because this was no longer just a conversation, it was a confrontation she had not seen coming. And as she looked at him now, really looked at him, the realization that had been forming since the moment he asked about the timeline began to take shape, incomplete but undeniable, and her voice came out softer this time, almost uncertain. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked, and Adrian did not hesitate this time, his answer coming with a clarity that shifted everything in an instant. "Because it might matter more than you think," he said, his eyes flicking briefly back to the child before returning to her. And in that moment, the air between them felt charged with something irreversible, something that was about to surface whether she was ready or not. Claire felt the words settle into her chest like a weight she could not push away, her fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the hospital bed as she searched Adrian's face for something that would make this make sense, something that would explain why he was looking at her child as if the answer to his questions had already been decided. But there was no hesitation in his expression now, no uncertainty, only a quiet, controlled resolve that made her pulse rise again. "You are not making sense," she said softly, but her voice lacked the certainty it had before, because deep down, a part of her already understood where this was going, even if she did not want to admit it. Adrian took a slow step closer, closing the remaining distance between them, his gaze unwavering as it moved briefly to the baby and then back to her. And when he spoke again, his voice was calm, but carried a finality that left no room for misunderstanding. 6 months, he repeated, which means he was conceived about 7 months ago, and Claire's breath caught instantly, her mind racing as the timeline unfolded in front of her, memories she had pushed aside, moments she had buried under survival and exhaustion suddenly rising to the surface with a clarity she had not expected. "That was around the time," Adrian continued, his tone steady but sharper now. "Around the time you disappeared from Blackwood Holdings without notice." And the name hit her again, harder this time, because now it connected, now it aligned with something she could not ignore. And her eyes widened slightly as she stared at him, recognition finally breaking through the confusion. You are the CEO," she whispered, the realization settling in fully for the first time, and Adrian did not deny it, did not soften it. He simply held her gaze, letting the truth exist between them without explanation. Claire's thoughts spiraled, her grip tightening unconsciously as she shook her head slightly. "That does not mean anything," she said quickly, her voice unsteady as she tried to hold on to the version of reality she had known until now. "You are making assumptions." But Adrian did not step back, did not let her deflect, his voice lowering again, more precise, more direct. "It means everything if you remember the night before you left," he said, and the air seemed to shift instantly, heavier, charged with something neither of them could pretend away. Claire's heart pounded harder, her gaze dropping for a fraction of a second before she forced herself to look back at him. Because she did remember, she remembered more than she had allowed herself to think about. And the realization that had been forming since the moment he asked about the timeline now stood in front of her, undeniable, impossible to ignore. "No," she whispered, shaking her head slightly. But it was not a denial. It was a reaction to the weight of what he was implying, to the sudden collapse of the distance she had built between her past and her present. Adrian's expression did not change, but there was something deeper in his eyes now, something that had shifted from suspicion to certainty. And when he spoke again, his voice was no longer questioning. It was a statement, controlled and unyielding. "Claire," he said quietly, her name carrying a gravity that made her chest tighten. "Why did you never tell me I have a son?" And the words landed between them like a final piece falling into place, leaving no room for doubt, no space to step back. Only the truth that had been building since the moment they met, now fully revealed. And Claire stood there, frozen, her breath caught somewhere between fear and disbelief, because in that single sentence, everything she had tried to keep separate had just collided, and there was no way to undo it.